The winter of 1929 did not descend upon Chicago. It grew out of the pavement like a grey fungus. It was a season of iron and slush, a time when the city felt less like a metropolis and more like a penal colony constructed of brick and ice. The wind that came off Lake Michigan was not merely cold, it was hostile. It carried the moisture of the deep water, freezing it against the wool coats of the men who walked the grid, turning their breath into thick, desperate plumes of steam. This was a city that worked. It smelled of the stockyards to the south, a heavy, copper scent of blood and rendering fat that the wind could never quite scrub away. And it smelled of the coal smoke that chugged from 10,000 chimneys, creating a permanent twilight. In the middle of this frozen industrial sprawl stood the garage on North Clark Street. It was number 2122, a number that meant nothing, attached to a building that promised nothing. It was the S.M.C. Cartage Company, a brick rectangle indistinguishable from the laundry across the street or the boarding house next door. But buildings, like men, have destinies that are often hidden behind mundane facades. The bricks of 2122 were porous, soaking up the grease of the trucks and the secrets of the men who gathered there. In the early weeks of February, the garage was a sanctuary. It was warm, heated by a coal stove that hissed in the corner, and it smelled of oil and stale tobacco. It was a place where men felt the illusion of safety, insulated from the biting wind and the law. They did not know that the architecture of their comfort was being measured for a different purpose. They did not know that the ordinary red bricks were waiting to be consecrated in a ritual of violence that would strip the city of its last pretense of civilization. The garage sat silent in the snow, a stage waiting for its actors, while the city around it groaned under the weight of its own ambition. To understand the blood, you must understand the soil it watered. The north side of Chicago was the kingdom of George "Bugs" Moran. It was a territory carved out of the old neighborhoods, the German and Irish strongholds where loyalty was tribal and the memory of the old country was still fresh. Moran was the archetype of the stoic patriarch, though his stoicism was brittle, born of a rage he struggled to contain. He was a man of the street, a brawler who believed in the visceral reality of violence, the punch, the knife, the drive-by shooting. He viewed himself as a traditionalist, a guardian of the way things used to be before the Italians came with their corporate structures and their business school approach to crime. His kingdom was loose, chaotic, and loud. It was run on adrenaline and pride. Moran hated Al Capone with a purity that was almost religious. He called Capone the Beast, mocking his background, his style, his very existence. This hatred was the fuel that powered the North Side engine. Moran's men were not soldiers in an army. They were knights in a doomed court. They hijacked trucks, not just for the profit, but for the insult it delivered to the South Side. They raided breweries and laughed about it in the speakeasies, drinking the spoils of war. They believed they were winning because they were louder, because they were bolder, because they had the romantic notion that courage could defeat calculation. They walked the streets of the North Side like kings, nodding to the shopkeepers, paying off the beat cops with rolls of cash held together by rubber bands. They were the masters of their domain, blind to the fact that they were living in a bubble of nostalgia and that the needle was already moving toward them. Miles to the south, in the smoke-filled suites of the Metropole Hotel, a different kind of power was humming. This was the domain of the outfit. If Moran's gang was a feudal warband, Capone's organization was Ford Motors. It was a machine. It did not operate on emotion, it operated on efficiency. The antagonist here was not a single man, but a system. The outfit viewed crime as a commodity, subject to the laws of supply and demand. Violence was not a sport, it was a line item in the budget, a necessary expenditure to ensure market stability. The Southsiders were the modern men of the underworld. They understood logistics, supply chains, and political leverage. They didn't just pay off cops, they bought the precincts. They didn't just threaten judges, they appointed them. At the head of this machine sat Al Capone. But by 1929, he was more than a gangster, he was a CEO. He was tired of the friction, the constant hijacking of his trucks, the shooting of his associates, the disrespect from Moran. It was bad for business. It created instability, and instability frightened the investors and the politicians. The decision to purge the North Side was not made in a fit of passion. It was reached in a boardroom atmosphere, a calculated strategic move to consolidate a monopoly. The machine analyzed the problem. Moran was the chaos variable. The solution was simple: remove the variable. The South Side operated with the terrifying silence of a predator that knows it is apex. They stopped responding to the taunts. They stopped the petty retaliations. They withdrew into the shadows, and in the silence, they began to grind the gears of the inevitable. The friction between the two tectonic plates of Chicago, the North and the South, had been grinding for years, producing tremors that the city had learned to ignore. A body in a drainage ditch here, a bombed storefront there. It was the background noise of the roaring 20s. But in the winter of 1928, leading into 1929, the frequency changed. It became a screech. Moran, emboldened by the lack of response from the South, pushed harder. He hijacked a major shipment of whiskey that belonged to the Capone faction. He was muscling in on the dog tracks, the gambling dens, the unions. He was no longer just a nuisance, he was an existential threat. He was costing the outfit millions. But the breaking point was not financial, it was existential. Moran had begun to target the leadership. He had put a price on the heads of the outfit's top men. The weary lawmen of Chicago, the honest detectives who worked the homicide beat, saw the signs. They saw the informants go quiet. They saw the low-level street dealers vanish from the corners. They knew the barometer was dropping. The city was holding its breath. The escalation had moved beyond the point of negotiation. There would be no sit-down, no truce, no dividing of the spoils. The bridge had been burned, and the fire was spreading back toward the shore. In the speakeasies, the jazz bands played louder to drown out the tension, but everyone knew. The smart money was moving to the sidelines. The gamblers knew that when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and in Chicago, the grass was made of concrete and flesh. The meeting that sealed the fate of the 7 men did not happen in a dark alley. It likely happened in a warm, well-lit room, perhaps in Florida, where Capone had retreated to establish his alibi, or in the back of a cigar shop in Cicero. The antagonist force gathered its technicians. This was not a job for thugs, it was a job for specialists. The plan required precision. It could not be a drive-by shooting. Moran had survived too many of those. It had to be absolute. It had to be a wiping of the slate. Jack "Machine Gun" McGurn is often credited with the architecture of the plan. He was a man who understood the psychology of the North Side. He knew their habits, their greed, and their hubris. The Council of War determined that they needed to catch the entire leadership together, in one place at one time. They needed a net. And to catch wolves, you do not use a snare, you use bait. They discussed the location, the S.M.C. Cartage Garage. It was perfect, enclosed, sound-dampened by the brick, located in the heart of enemy territory where the victims would feel safest. They discussed the method. It had to be quick. It had to be overwhelming. And crucially, it had to buy them time to escape. The idea of the police uniforms was introduced. It was a stroke of dark genius. It exploited the one weakness of the hardened criminal, their conditioned response to authority. It was a psychological hack. The council adjourned with the plan set. The budget was approved. The death warrants were signed, invisible ink on the ledger of the city. The tools of the trade were selected with the care of a surgeon choosing scalpels. The Thompson submachine gun, the Chicago Typewriter, was the weapon of choice. Chambered in .45 ACP, it was a heavy, brutal instrument designed for trench warfare. It did not just kill, it destroyed. It turned cover into dust and men into memories. 2 Thompsons were procured. One was equipped with a 20-round box magazine, the other with a 50-round drum. They were tested, oiled, and checked for jams. A 12-gauge shotgun was added to the arsenal for close-range finality. The car was stolen, a Cadillac touring sedan, black, indistinguishable from the detective cruisers used by the Chicago Police Department. It was fitted with a siren and a gong, the auditory signals of the law. The uniforms were sourced, likely through the vast network of corrupt officials or stolen from lockers. Every detail was attended to. The loyal sons who would carry out the hit were brought in from out of town. They were strangers to the North Side, faces that Moran's men would not recognize. This was a crucial layer of security. If things went wrong, if there were witnesses, they would describe men who did not exist in the local rogues gallery. These men were professionals. They did not hate the Reinhardts or the Gusenbergs. To them, this was a contract. They checked the weapons, they tried on the uniforms, they drove the route. They were the mechanics of death, preparing to service the machine. The plan required a voice, a contact, someone to deliver the lie, a hijacker, someone on the fringe of the gangs who could plausibly claim to have a shipment of stolen whiskey, was activated. He made the call to Moran's people. He told them he had a truckload of old log cabin whiskey, high quality, bonded stuff, hijacked from the South Siders in Detroit. He offered it at a price that was a steal. The greed of the North Side was the lever. They had been intercepting shipments for months. This felt like just another win. The caller set the time, 10:30 a.m., the date, Thursday, February 14th, St. Valentine's Day. The irony was likely lost on the participants at the time. It was just a Thursday. The deal was set for the garage. The bait was taken. The Judas goat had done his job, leading the sheep to the pen. Moran took the bait personally. He wanted to be there. He wanted to see the quality of the goods. He told his top men to be ready. The trap was primed. The voice on the phone hung up, and the connection was severed, leaving only the promise of easy money hanging in the air. The symbolic object here was the whiskey, amber liquid in glass bottles, the currency of the Prohibition era, the liquid gold that men died for. It was a phantom shipment, a mirage that would draw 7 men to their doom. The garage at 2122 North Clark was now more than a building. It was a pressure cooker. On the morning of the 13th, the day before, the air inside seemed heavy. The mechanics, John May and the others, went about their work fixing the trucks that hauled the gang's beer. They tuned engines, changed tires, and stoked the coal stove. They were the background characters, the ones who kept the wheels turning. They had no idea that their workplace had been targeted. The layout of the garage was simple. A long, narrow space with a few trucks parked along the wall, a workbench covered in tools, and a small partition for an office. There was no back exit that was easily accessible. It was a tunnel with one mouth. The antagonist force had studied blueprints or had lookouts describe the interior. They knew that once the men were inside, if the front doors were blocked, there was nowhere to go. The brick walls that kept the winter wind out would keep the bullets in. The acoustics were perfect for a massacre. The noise would be contained, muffled by the heavy doors and the snow outside. The trap was not just the plan, It was the physical space itself. The geometry of the room dictated the formation of the execution. A line of men against a wall. It was the only way they would fit. The architecture conspired with the killers. The night of February 13th was bitter cold. The city huddled under a blanket of frost. In the speakeasies and the jazz clubs, the party went on, frantic and desperate. But in the boarding houses and apartments of the North Side gang members, there was a mundane domesticity. These men went home to wives, to girlfriends, to dogs. They ate dinner. They checked the morning paper. They polished their shoes. Frank Gusenberg, the enforcer, likely cleaned his gun, a futile gesture against what was coming. Albert Kachelek, the second in command, perhaps made a phone call. They were living the last hours of their lives in the banal routine of existence. They slept. They dreamed. Meanwhile, across the city, the loyal sons of the South Side were not sleeping. They were going over the timeline. 10:30 a.m. The Cadillac, the uniforms, the entry, the exit. It was a choreography of violence that had to be executed to the second. The storm was not coming from the sky. It was coming from the intent of men. The pressure was building, invisible and silent, pressing against the windows of the city. The inevitable march of time ticked away the seconds. Every tick of the clock was a step closer to the wall. Dawn on February 14th broke grey and lifeless. The sun struggled to penetrate the cloud cover, casting a flat, diffuse light over Chicago. It was 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind howled through the canyons of the Loop. At the garage, the day began like any other. The mechanic, John May, arrived early. He fired up the stove. The dog, Highball, was tied to a truck, his tail wagging, happy to see his master. The coffee was put on. Slowly, the others began to trickle in. The Gusenberg brothers, Heyer, Schwimmer. They stamped the snow off their boots, rubbing their hands together, complaining about the cold. They were dressed in their heavy overcoats, fedoras pulled low. They stood around the stove, smoking, joking. They were waiting for the truck of whiskey. They were waiting for Bugs Moran. They felt secure. They were the North Side gang, the toughest crew in the city. Who would touch them? They checked their watches. 10:15, 10:20. The conversation was sparse, utilitarian. Where's the truck? It's coming. Where's Bugs? He's late. They did not know that their lives had been reduced to a countdown. Outside, the black Cadillac turned onto North Clark Street. The tires crunched on the frozen asphalt. The police were putting on their hats. The siren gave a short, low wail, the sound of authority, the sound of the end. Inside the garage, heads turned toward the door. Cops, someone muttered. Stash the piece. They relaxed. It was just a raid. It was just the cost of doing business. The last sunrise they would ever see was hidden behind the clouds, and the darkness was walking through the front door. When the heavy wooden doors of the S.M.C. cartage garage swung open, the light that entered was grey and diffracted by the winter air, but the authority that entered was absolute. 4 men, 2 in the long, heavy trench coats of civilians, their hats pulled low to obscure the architecture of their faces. 2 in the crisp, brass-buttoned uniforms of the Chicago Police Department. This visual was the fulcrum upon which the entire massacre pivoted. You must understand the psychology of the professional criminal in 1929 to understand why 7 armed men did not reach for their weapons. In their world, the police were a hazard, yes, but a manageable one. They were a transaction. A raid meant a ride in the paddy wagon, a few hours in a holding cell that smelled of bleach and urine, a phone call to a lawyer paid for by the syndicate, and a release before dinner. It was a ritual. It was the cost of doing business, like paying for gas or tires. So when the command came, "Get 'em up, against the wall," it was obeyed not out of cowardice, but out of calculation. The 7 men inside the garage, Frank and Peter Gusenberg, The enforcers, Albert Kachelek, the second in command, Adam Heyer, the accountant, Reinhard Schwimmer, the thrill-seeker, John May, the mechanic, and Al Weinshank, the speakeasy manager. They saw the uniforms, and they saw the path of least resistance. They did not see the executioners, they saw the bureaucracy. They turned their backs, they faced the north wall. They raised their hands, pressing their palms against the red brick that was cold enough to numb the skin. They spread their legs, they waited for the pat-down, they waited for the handcuffs. They stared at the mortar lines, perhaps counting the seconds until they could smoke again. In that moment, the garage was silent save for the shuffling of boots on the oil-stained concrete and the heavy breathing of men who had been startled. The deception was total. The weary lawman archetype had been weaponized. The symbol of protection had been inverted into a tool of annihilation. The men behind them were not reaching for handcuffs. They were reaching into the deep pockets of their coats, bypassing the non-lethal tools of the state to retrieve the instruments of industrial slaughter. The victims stood in a neat row, 7 silhouettes against the brick, unknowingly posing for a photograph that would be etched into the national consciousness. They were compliant sheep, sheared of their aggression by the lie of the uniform, waiting for a shepherd who had brought wolves in his wake. The sound of a Thompson submachine gun is not a bang, it is a stutter. It is a mechanical ripping, a rhythmic percussion that sounds like a jackhammer striking sheet metal. When the triggers were depressed, the silence of the garage was not broken, it was obliterated. There were 2 machine guns, one with a 20-round box magazine, the other with a 50-round drum. They opened up simultaneously. The distance was less than 10 feet. At that range, ballistics ceased to be a matter of probability and become a matter of physics. The 45 caliber rounds, heavy and slow-moving compared to rifle bullets, hit with the force of sledgehammers. They did not just puncture, they pushed. The line of 7 men did not fall immediately. They danced. It is a grotesque image, but the force of the impacts jerked them against the wall, keeping them upright for a fraction of a second longer than gravity should have allowed. Dust from the bricks exploded outward, mixing with the spray of blood to create a pink mist that hung in the freezing air. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that assaulted the eardrums, echoing off the hard surfaces of the garage until the air itself seemed to vibrate. The shooters swept the guns from left to right, then back again, a mowing motion that was methodical and practiced. The bricks behind the men disintegrated, turning into shrapnel that added to the carnage. The smell of cordite, acrid, sulphurous, burning, filled the space instantly, overpowering the smell of gasoline. It was the scent of war. In the span of perhaps 10 seconds, hundreds of rounds were expended. The roar ceased as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by the hollow clatter of empty casings hitting the floor. But the work was not done. The machine required certainty. The 2 shooters with the Thompsons stepped back, and the men with the shotguns stepped forward. This was the coup de grace, the finality. They walked down the line of crumpled bodies, the heaps of wool coats and tweed that were now indistinguishable from one another, and they delivered the final blasts. It was excessive. It was performative. It was a message written in gore that said, "There are no survivors. There are no witnesses. There is no mercy." The garage floor was now a slick, dark lake. The only sound remaining was the hissing of the radiator on a truck that had been strayed by a bullet, and the wet, ragged gasps of Frank Gusenberg, who, defying all medical logic, was still clinging to a life that had already left him. The genius of the plan lay not in the entry but in the exit. Any thug can kick down a door and start shooting. It takes a professional to walk away without raising an alarm. The gunfire, though loud, was muffled by the thick brick walls and the snow-dampened air of the city. To the casual listener outside, it might have sounded like a truck backfiring, a common sound in a city of engines. But the shooters could not take that chance. They had to leave the garage and cross the sidewalk to their car in broad daylight. If they ran, they would look like criminals. If they carried the smoking guns, they would be identified. So they returned to the script. The two men in the police uniforms put away their weapons. The two men in civilian clothes, the actual shooters, raised their hands above their heads. The officers marched them out of the garage at gunpoint. To anyone watching from the windows across the street, and there were eyes watching, it looked like a successful police raid. 2 officers had apprehended 2 suspects and were taking them into custody. It was a piece of street theatre, a grim pantomime performed over the cooling bodies of 7 men. They walked calmly to the black Cadillac. The suspects got into the back. The officers got into the front. There was no screeching of tires, no getaway speed. The car pulled away from the curb with the dignified pace of official business. They turned the corner and vanished into the grid of Chicago traffic, dissolving back into the city that had birthed them. They left behind no fingerprints, for they had worn gloves. They left behind no weapon, for they took the guns with them. They left behind only the silence, which rushed back into the garage to fill the void left by the noise. The deception held until the very last moment, a perfect circle of lies that protected the guilty and doomed the innocent. The machine had completed its cycle. The technicians had clocked out. The silence in the garage did not last. It was broken by a sound that was more haunting than the gunfire. Highball, the German shepherd belonging to John May, was tied to the bumper of one of the trucks. He had not been shot. He had stood there, straining at his rope, watching the men he knew being torn apart by the men he did not. Animals react to the scent of blood with a primal terror, and Highball began to howl. It was a low, mournful sound that rose in pitch until it became a keen of despair. It echoed off the blood-spattered bricks and drifted out through the closed doors, carrying the news of the massacre to the street. Mrs. Landersman, the landlady who lived next door, had heard the racket. She had heard the clatter of the machine guns and assumed it was machinery. But the dog would not stop. The sound chilled her. It was the sound of something wrong, something deeply, fundamentally unnatural. She sent a boarder, a man named McAllister, to check the garage. He walked to the front door. He pushed it open. The smell hit him first, the metallic, copper tang of blood so thick you could taste it, mixed with the smoky haze of gunpowder. Then he saw the light slanting in through the dusty windows, illuminating the dust motes that were still dancing in the turbulent air. And then he saw the pile. It didn't look like men. It looked like a heap of discarded laundry, a tangle of coats and limbs. But the blood was moving. It was pooling, seeking the low points in the concrete floor, creeping toward his shoes. The dog was barking now, snapping at the air, mad with fear. McAllister backed away, his mind struggling to process the visual data. He ran back to the boarding house, his face pale, his voice trembling. "The garage," he stammered. "They're all dead. The dog is crying." The police were called. When the real officers arrived, Sergeant Thomas Loftus and his partner, they entered with guns drawn, expecting a shootout. Instead, they found a graveyard. Loftus, a veteran of the force, a man who had seen the worst the city had to offer, had to step back and cover his mouth. It was not a crime scene, it was an abattoir. Amidst the carnage, there was movement. Frank Gusenberg was a man of the North Side, a creature of the underworld whose cells were steeped in the code of omerta, silence. He had been hit 14 times. 14.45 caliber slugs had passed through his body. He should have been dead before he hit the floor. But the human body is a stubborn thing, and Frank was crawling. He was dragging himself through the blood of his brother and his friends, trying to reach… what? The door? A weapon? Or just moving because the instinct to live refused to be extinguished? Sergeant Loftus knelt beside him. The officer saw the wounds. He knew this man was a ghost in the making. But he also knew this was the only lead, the only chance to catch the monsters who had done this. He leaned close, his ear near Frank's lips, which were bubbling with blood. "Frank," Loftus asked, his voice urgent, "in God's name, who shot you?" Frank Gusenberg looked up. His eyes were glazing over, the light fading rapidly. He recognized the cop. He knew the game. He knew that in his world, you do not talk to the law, not even when the law is the only thing holding your hand as you die. "Nobody shot me," Frank whispered. It was a lie of such immense magnitude, such profound loyalty to a broken system, that it defies comprehension. Nobody shot me. He was sticking to the script. He was protecting the very nature of the game that had killed him. They loaded him onto a stretcher. They rushed him to the Alexian Brothers Hospital. The doctors worked on him, but there was nothing to be fixed. He was a colander of flesh. Police continued to press him. "Who did it, Frank? Was it the outfit? Was it McGurn?" Frank stared at the ceiling, his breath rattling in his chest. "I ain't no copper," he wheezed, and then he died. He took the names of his killers to the grave, preserving the code of the street, even as it betrayed him. It was the ultimate act of the loyal son, a final defiance against the weary lawman, a tragic, futile gesture of honor in a room devoid of it. The next morning, the city of Chicago woke up to a nightmare printed in black and white. The newspapers did not hold back. The Chicago Tribune, the Daily News, they splashed the photographs across the front page. The image of the 7 bodies lying in a heap against the brick wall became the defining icon of the Prohibition era. The public reaction was instantaneous and seismic. Before February 14, 1929, there had been a certain romanticism attached to the gangster. They were seen by some as service providers, rebels against the puritanical laws of the Volstead Act. They were colorful characters in pinstripe suits. But this was not romantic. This was industrial slaughter. The sheer brutality of it shocked the American conscience. The fact that it happened on St. Valentine's Day, a day of romance, added a macabre irony that the press exploited ruthlessly. "Massacre," shouted the headlines. The illusion of the gentleman bandit was shattered. The public saw the blood on the floor and realized that the corruption of their city had reached a terminal stage. It was no longer a game of cops and robbers. It was a war zone. The outcry was deafening. Civic leaders, clergy, and ordinary citizens demanded action. They demanded that the federal government step in because the local government was clearly impotent or complicit. The antagonist force, the syndicate, had overplayed its hand. In seeking to demonstrate absolute power, they had triggered a reaction that would ultimately dismantle their empire. The photos of the massacre did what no sermon could. They stripped the glamour from the sin and left only the ugly, naked violence. The investigation that followed was a turning point in the history of forensic science. The Chicago police were overwhelmed, their ranks filled with men on Capone's payroll. But a coroner's jury was assembled, and a key figure emerged, Dr. Calvin Goddard. He was a pioneer in the field of forensic ballistics, a man who believed that bullets told stories that witnesses refused to tell. The weary lawmen who were honest, and there were some, turned to him. Goddard examined the casings found at the scene. He examined the slugs pulled from the bodies and the bricks. He used a comparison microscope, a piece of technology that was cutting edge at the time. He proved, scientifically and irrefutably, that the weapons used were 2 specific Thompson submachine guns. He proved they were not police-issue weapons, debunking the theory that the police themselves had carried out the hit, though the killers had worn uniforms. Later, When police raided the home of Fred "Killer" Burke, a known associate of the outfit, they found 2 Thompson guns. Goddard tested them. The markings on the bullets matched perfectly. It was the first time in American history that ballistics had been used to definitively link a specific weapon to a specific crime on such a high-profile stage. The scientific truth began to erode the code of silence. The machine could bribe a witness, but it could not bribe a microscope. The bricks of the garage wall, riddled with holes, became data points. The massacre, intended to be a mystery, became a lesson in the new reality of crime fighting. The era of the gumshoe was ending. The era of the lab coat was beginning. Al Capone was in Florida when the shots were fired. He had a subpoena to appear before a federal grand jury, but he claimed he was too sick to travel. He had a doctor's note. He was seen at the racetrack, smiling, shaking hands, the picture of innocence. He thought he had won. He had destroyed the North Side gang. He was the undisputed king of Chicago. But he did not understand the nature of the enemy he had awakened. The massacre had embarrassed the President of the United States, Herbert Hoover. It had made American law enforcement the laughingstock of the world. Hoover ordered the federal government to get Capone. The antagonist force was no longer just a local gang. It was a national priority. Since they could not link him directly to the murders, the shooters were in hiding, the witnesses were dead or silent, they took a different angle. The Treasury Department. The Secret Six, a group of wealthy Chicago businessmen, funded a secret investigation into Capone's finances. They didn't look for blood, they looked for ink. They looked for the money. The massacre was the catalyst that accelerated the tax evasion case. It created the political will to destroy him. Capone, who had insulated himself with layers of violence, was brought down by the banality of the tax code. In 1931, 2 years after the massacre, he was convicted. The king was dethroned not by a rival gangster, but by accountants. The stoic patriarch of the South Side ended up rotting in Alcatraz, his mind eaten away by syphilis, a ghost in a cell. The massacre was his greatest tactical victory and his greatest strategic defeat. What of the others? Bugs Moran, the target who was never hit, died a slow death of the soul. He lost his nerve. He lost his prestige. The North Side kingdom evaporated. Moran drifted into petty crimes, robbing banks, passing bad checks. He died in Leavenworth Federal Prison in 1957, a forgotten old man, penniless and alone. The loyal sons who pulled the triggers did not fare much better. Machine Gun McGurn, the architect of the hit, was assassinated in a bowling alley in 1936. Someone walked up to him and put a bullet in his head. The legend says they left a Valentine card on his body, but that may be apocryphal. The point remains, violence begets violence. The energy released in that garage did not dissipate. It traveled through time, claiming the participants one by one. The garage itself became a macabre tourist attraction. The owner, tired of the ghouls who came to stare at the bullet holes, eventually tore it down in 1967. But the bricks, the symbolic objects, were saved. They were bought by a Canadian businessman who reassembled the wall in a nightclub bathroom in Vancouver. Later, they were sold to a mob museum in Las Vegas. The physical evidence of the tragedy was commodified, turned into a backdrop for selfies. But the curse of the event seemed to cling to the artifacts. There are stories of bad luck, of hauntings, associated with those blood-soaked clays. The shadow of 1929 stretches long and cold, touching everyone who tries to own a piece of it. If you go to 2122 North Clark Street today, the address exists, but the place does not. It is a parking lot for a nursing home. There is a small lawn, a few trees, the mundane hum of modern Chicago traffic. The wind still blows off the lake, cutting through the heavy coats of pedestrians who walk past the spot without knowing what lies beneath their feet. The blood has long since been washed away. The oil stains are gone. The cathedral of red brick has been erased from the skyline. But places have memory. The ground remembers. Stand there in the middle of February, when the grey slush covers the asphalt, and listen. Can you hear the echo of the Thompson guns? Can you hear the howl of the dog? The story of the St. Valentine's Day massacre is not just a story about gangsters. It is a story about the failure of society. It is a mirror held up to a time when we allowed a shadow government to rule our streets because we wanted a drink. We, the people, were the consumers who funded the bullets. As you stand in that empty lot, ask yourself, what is the price of your own vices? When the systems of law break down, when we accept corruption as the cost of convenience, we pave the way for the massacre. The bricks may be in a museum, but the nature of the machine, the greed, the power, the violence, remains. It has just changed its shape. The wall is gone, but we are all still standing against it, waiting for the sound of the typewriter. What would you do if the door opened and the authority you trusted turned out to be the executioner? Would you turn your back, or would you fight? The ghosts of the 7 men are still wandering.